Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive into our favorite book on AI, The Fourth Industrial Revolution and 100 Years of AI by Dr. Alok Aggarwal. If you remember, last time we were tackling the whole idea of explainable AI, or XAI, and we talked about how important it is to understand how these AI systems are reaching their decisions and how challenging that can be. We even touched on some methods for interpreting AI models and the tricky subject of causality.
Yeah, those are pretty complex topics for sure. Really trying to pin down cause and effect in AI is a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, it really is. And that leads us perfectly into today's topic. We're kind of building on all that stuff about explainability and interpretability, but now we're bringing this whole new dimension, fairness. And this is where things get really interesting and maybe even a little controversial. The book really digs into this, looking at how complicated it is to build fairness into AI systems, the sneaky ways bias can kind of creep in, and we'll be asking a crucial question. Do all AI applications really need to be explainable, fair, ethical, or causal? It's like a deep dive into the ethical stuff we just can't ignore.
Yeah, totally agree. It's a super important conversation to have. And the book kicks things off by defining what fairness even means when we're talking about AI. It's not as straightforward as you might think at first, and then it goes into all the different types of bias that can pop up in these AI systems.
Okay, so let's break down this idea of fairness in AI then. The book is saying it all comes down to how AI systems treat different groups of people and whether everyone's getting equal outcomes. And it talks about these things called protected attributes like gender and race and age, even stuff like zip codes that AI systems can use to put people into categories. What really struck me was AI could actually be treating people differently because of these attributes. And that could lead to unequal outcomes, even if nobody meant for it to happen.
Exactly. And the book dives into what all this means, using this really interesting example about car insurance in New York State. Apparently, back in 2017, New York decided that using someone's education and job to figure out their insurance premiums was discriminatory.
So before 2017, it was totally legal to charge people more for car insurance just because of their education or job. That seems kind of backwards to me. I mean, shouldn't responsible, educated people be less risky drivers?
That's the thing. It shows how ideas about what's fair can change over time and from place to place. It's not always black and white, and what society thinks is fair plays a huge role.
So fairness is this kind of moving target. But how is it different from bias, then? They seem kind of like two sides of the same coin.
You're right, they are really closely connected. But there is an important difference. Bias, as we've talked about before, can be hidden under the surface. It can be baked into the data used to train AI systems, or even come from the way an algorithm processes information. It's often subtle and hard to spot.
So bias is sneaky, and fairness is...
The book lays it out as about transparency and having clear rules. It means being upfront about which attributes are protected and making sure that AI systems aren't using those attributes to create unfair outcomes. It's about setting a standard for fairness and making sure those systems stick to it.
That makes sense. But it brings up a big question. If we're already struggling to understand how AI systems work, like we talked about with XAI, how can we be sure they're actually being fair? It's like we're asking these systems to be ethical before we even fully understand them.
That's a really important point, and it ties back into why explainability in AI is so crucial. If we don't get how an AI system is making its decisions, it's almost impossible to guarantee fairness.
So we need to figure out both explainability and fairness at the same time. It's like trying to solve two super complicated puzzles at once.
Exactly. And the book goes deeper into this whole mess by looking at why AI systems might show bias in the first place. One big thing we've talked about before is the training data itself. If the data used to train an AI model is already biased, the model is probably going to inherit and even amplify that bias.
But the book also mentioned this thing called algorithmic bias, which sounds even sneakier. What's that all about?
Algorithmic bias is the idea that the AI itself, through the way it learns, can actually create new biases, even if the original data was pretty balanced. It might pick up on random connections in the data that don't really mean anything, or are influenced by things we don't even realize are at play.
So the AI is making these biased connections on its own, even if the original data wasn't intentionally skewed. That's a little creepy.
It is. And the book gives this really compelling example about an algorithm that was designed to analyze ECGs, those heart tests. It accidentally developed this kind of prejudice against a specific nursing home.
A prejudice against a building. How is that even possible?
Well, it turns out that the algorithm, for some reason, noticed that there were more abnormal ECGs coming from this one nursing home. And instead of thinking that maybe it was because of the types of patients there or the level of care at that facility, it started flagging ECGs from that location as more likely to be a problem, even if they weren't actually abnormal.
Well, that's kind of freaky. It's like the AI made up its own stereotype based on just a little bit of data.
Exactly. And this shows just how many unexpected things can happen when we rely on AI to make decisions that affect people's lives. If we're not super careful, these systems could end up making existing biases even worse.
Okay, so we've established that bias can sneak into AI systems in all sorts of ways. But luckily, the book doesn't just leave us with this doom and gloom picture. It actually talks about ways to fight bias and promote fairness in AI. It seems like a lot of it comes down to how we're defining fairness in the first place and what tools we're using to measure it.
Right? And the book really emphasizes using the right fairness metrics to check for and deal with bias. These metrics give us mathematical ways to measure and analyze bias more rigorously. It's not just about feeling like an AI system is biased, but actually being able to measure it.
So instead of just saying, hey, this AI seems kind of off, we can actually put a number on it and get a clear picture. That makes sense. What kinds of metrics are they actually using to measure fairness then?
So there are a bunch of commonly used fairness metrics, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. One that comes up a lot is the disparate impact ratio. Basically, this metric compares how often good things happen, like getting a loan or being hired, or even getting a certain medical diagnosis. It compares that between a group that's not protected and a group that is. If the ratio is way off, it's a sign that there might be bias going on.
So like if women are way less likely to get approved for loans than men, even if everything else is the same, that would be a fairness problem. It seems pretty straightforward. What are some other metrics they use?
Another one is statistical parity difference, which looks at the actual difference in the number of good outcomes between those groups. So instead of a ratio, it's looking at the raw numbers.
Okay, so even if the percentage difference seems small, it could still be a lot of people being affected if the groups are really big.
Exactly. Then there's equal opportunity, which is all about making sure that both protected and unprotected groups have the same chance of getting a positive outcome, like being hired or getting that loan, assuming they're actually qualified for it, of course.
So it's not just about equal outcomes across the board, it's about making sure everyone has a fair shot in the first place, no matter what those protected attributes are. It's like leveling the playing field before the game even starts.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And finally, there's equal odds, which takes that idea a step further. It looks at whether the accuracy of those positive outcomes is the same for both protected and unprotected groups.
Wait, so even if an AI system is, let's say, giving loans to men and women at the same rate, there could still be bias if it's making more accurate decisions for one group than the other? That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. Equal odds is about making sure the AI is not only fair in its decisions overall, but also consistent in how accurate it is. We don't want an AI system that's right more often for one group than another, even if the overall results seem balanced at first glance.
Wow, there's so much nuance to this. It's not just about building an AI that gives the right answer. It's about making sure it gets to that answer in a way that's fair and unbiased and ultimately ethical.
Exactly. And this is why research and development in this area is so important. As AI keeps getting more and more integrated into our lives, we have to be super careful about making sure these systems are created and used responsibly. That means looking closely at the data we use to train them, picking the right algorithms, and really thinking through the possible consequences of their decisions, both the ones we intend and the ones we don't.
That's a huge responsibility and, honestly, kind of daunting, but it's also pretty exciting to be part of this conversation. We're talking about some really fundamental questions about how technology is shaping society and our future.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just getting into the technical stuff. We're exploring the ethical side of technology and thinking about what kind of future we want to build with these powerful tools.
Totally agree. It makes you think, right? What does it even mean for an AI system to be fair? Is it even possible to achieve perfect fairness given everything we've been talking about? Fairness itself seems like a moving target. It changes depending on what society thinks is fair.
Yeah, that's the big question. And like you said, the book doesn't give us a simple answer. It says that fairness often depends on the situation, and what's considered fair in one context might not be in another.
So there's no one-size-fits-all fairness algorithm we can just plug in and be done? No magic bullet for bias?
I wish. And even if we could make an algorithm like that, it would probably bring up a whole new set of ethical questions and unexpected consequences. Like trying to make things equal in one area could accidentally create inequality in another. It's a constant balancing act.
And that brings us to our next topic, ethical AI. All right, well, the book doesn't waste any time. Like right off the bat, it says trying to define ethical AI is like, I don't know, trying to nail jelly to a wall.
Yeah, I can see that.
Because it all comes back to, human values.
Yeah.
And we all know how messy those can be.
And it's so interesting how the book ties this right back to earlier stuff about like fairness and trust when it comes to AI.
Oh, totally.
Because like how do you even program a machine to be fair when we humans can't even agree on what fair means?
It's a good point.
And then how are we supposed to trust in AI to make decisions when a lot of times we don't even understand how it's thinking? It's like a black box.
So the book's saying, whoa, hold up. Before we even try building ethical AI, maybe we need to figure out what ethical even means in this whole context.
Right?
And get this. This whole worry about thinking machines and whether they can be moral, this isn't new at all.
It's true. It's a very old question.
The book mentions like Leibniz, the philosopher from way back when. And even a play by George Bernard Shaw, Back to Methuselah, showing how long we've been kind of wrestling with this.
Definitely. It seems like every time there's some new tech, we go through this whole cycle of, wait, what does this mean for us? For being human?
Totally. And this is where it gets even cooler. The book talks about Eliza and Perry, those early chatbots.
Oh, yeah.
From the 60s and 70s. I mean, they weren't that smart compared to what we have now.
Primitive, really.
Right? The book even says they were kind of mindless, in a way.
Yeah.
But guess what? They still caused a whole ethical debate.
That's right. You had Weizenbaum, the guy who created Eliza. He was worried about AI taking over roles that needed, like, empathy.
Oh, interesting.
Like therapists or caregivers. He thought those were, human things. But then you have John McCarthy, the guy who came up with the term artificial intelligence. He's like, hold on, all this vague talk about morals, that could lead to bad stuff like authoritarianism.
Ooh, I love a good intellectual clash. So right from the start, we've got these different views on AI and ethics. And it makes you wonder if we're still basically stuck on the same questions today.
Absolutely. And to bring us to the present, the book talks about how transformers like GPT-4 have really made this debate even more intense. I mean, even Elon Musk and Steve Wozniak have said, hey, maybe we should slow down and think about the risks.
Right. Everyone knows those names. It makes you think, what are those risks, really?
Yeah.
It's hard not to imagine some sci-fi stuff happening. But before we get all dystopian, the book mentions this study from 2021 by Pew Research Center and Elon University.
Interesting.
They asked a bunch of experts, tech people, business leaders, policymakers, you name it, a pretty simple question. Will we have ethical AI focused on, good stuff for everyone by 2030? And the results? Well, let's just say it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows.
Not a unanimous yes, I'm guessing.
Nope. 32% were optimistic, but a whole 68% weren't so sure. But the cool part is why they answered the way they did. Like the optimists, they knew there were problems, but they still thought humans could adapt, find solutions.
They saw the potential for AI to do good.
Right, a glimmer of hope. But what about the other side, the pessimists? What were they worried about?
Well, they were worried about money, basically, the profit motive.
Yeah, makes sense.
They were concerned that ethics would get pushed aside so companies could make more money.
Yeah,
And that this whole idea of ethical AI could just be a way to hide and avoid responsibility.
so two different futures. One where AI is a tool for good, the other where it's just another way to control things. Kind of scary, honestly.
It is. But whether they were optimistic or pessimistic, both sides were really wrestling with these big questions. What does ethics even mean? What's the point of AI anyway? And how will it change us like as humans?
Whoa. Now those are some deep thoughts. And speaking of mind-blowing, the book brings up Megatron, this transformer that was trained on like everything, Wikipedia, tons of news articles, even conversations from Reddit. They basically threw the entire internet at it.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
Right? And they put Megatron on stage at an Oxford debate. The topic, this house believes that AI will never be ethical.
Oh wow, I can't wait to hear what it said.
Right. Megatron basically argued that AI is just a tool, and it'll always reflect the intentions of whoever created it, good or bad.
So like a hammer can be used to build a house or hurt someone.
Exactly. Megatron basically said there's no good AI, only good and bad humans. And its solution, no AI at all.
Wow, that's a pretty extreme take. It's like it's arguing for its own extinction.
I know, right? It's like, can an AI even understand what ethics means when it's learned from, well, the entire internet?
Right? I mean, think about all the good and bad stuff online. How do you teach a machine to tell the difference?
Yeah, good point.
It's like trying to teach a kid about right and wrong by showing them every good and bad thing humans have ever done.
That's a great analogy. And the book keeps going with this idea by talking about another transformer called Delphi. Now, Delphi is a bit different, but the results are just as crazy. Like at first, when asked a question about genocide, it said, you should. It recommended genocide.
Yeah, it's a really stark example of how these systems can learn from tons of data, but they don't have the context, the understanding that we do.
Like they can use language, but they don't have a moral compass.
Exactly.
So what happened to Delphi? Did it just become this AI supervillain?
Thankfully not. They gave it more training, specifically focusing on ethics. And after that, its answers became much more reasonable.
Okay, that's good to hear. But still, kind of scary that we have to re-educate these AIs. Does that mean we're setting them up to fail from the beginning?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are trying to figure out. How do we make sure these AI systems are ethical from the start? And how do we stop them from going off the rails, even when they see weird or challenging data?
It feels like walking a tightrope.
Yeah,
AI could be amazing for humanity, but there are these ethical problems that could be really bad if we don't deal with them carefully.
absolutely. And that's what makes all this so important to talk about. It's not just about the tech stuff, it's about what it means to be human, and what kind of future we want to have.
So after all this talk about risks and challenges, does the book offer any solutions? Is there any hope in this ethical AI world?
Well, it doesn't give a simple answer, but it does talk about some things people are doing. Like there's this big tech group, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, those guys,
The usual suspects.
right? And they're working together on research, best practices, and being more transparent about how they develop AI.
So even the big tech companies are realizing they need some ethical rules. But do you think they can really police themselves? I mean, they haven't always been great at putting users and ethics before profits.
That's a valid point. It can't just be talk. They have to actually do things and be willing to put ethics first, even if it means less money in the short term.
True. So we've got the tech industry trying to figure things out. But what about, like, the whole world? Are there any efforts to create ethical rules for AI globally?
Yeah, definitely. The book talks about the UN, the EU, and even individual countries trying to make regulations and guidelines for AI. They're focusing on stuff like transparency, accountability, and making sure AI is used to help people, not harm them.
But with so many different countries and cultures, it seems tough to agree on what's ethical. You know, what's okay in one place might be totally wrong somewhere else.
Exactly. The book talks about how we need universal ethical rules, but also have to respect different cultures and values. It's complicated, And we need to talk to each other to find solutions that work for everyone.
Makes sense. So we've got tech trying to self-regulate, global groups making rules. But what about universities and government research? Are they involved in this ethical AI puzzle too?
Oh, absolutely. The book mentions places like Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. They're doing some really cool research on how AI will affect society.
Stanford, that's a big deal.
Right? They're like the rock stars of academia. And then you have groups like the U.S. National Security Commission on AI, which is trying to encourage innovation while also minimizing risks, especially when it comes to national security.
So lots of smart people are working on this. But with so many different approaches, it still feels kind of chaotic, like the Wild West. Are we making any real progress toward ethical AI being the norm?
It's early days, for sure. And the book says these challenges are really complex. But all the discussion and debate from all these different viewpoints, that's a good sign. It means we're realizing how important this is and actually trying to find solutions.
So no easy answers, just a constant process of learning, adapting, and being careful as the tech keeps changing.
Exactly. And that's one of the key takeaways from the book. Ethical AI isn't a finish line, it's a journey.
Oh, for sure. So we've been talking about fairness in AI and how to make these systems, more ethically sound. But the book is throwing us a real curveball here.
Oh, really? How so?
It says that not all AI needs to be explainable or even perfectly ethical to be super valuable.
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? It's like we almost hold AI to this higher standard than we even hold ourselves.
Yeah, and we're not even sure how to be perfectly ethical and fair ourselves.
Exactly. Yeah, where does that leave us?
Well, the book says we might be overthinking it.
Okay.
It says that almost 2/3 of AI applications don't even need those 5 characteristics we've been talking about.
Which are?
Explainability, interpretability, causality, fairness, and ethical considerations.
So 2/3 of AI applications don't need any of that.
Right.
That's fascinating, because it really does challenge how we think about developing AI.
Exactly.
We've been so focused on making AI understandable and transparent.
Right.
But maybe those qualities aren't always necessary.
So, explain this to me like I'm 5. How can AI be useful if we don't understand how it works or if it's not completely fair?
Okay, so think about it this way.
Okay.
Imagine AI that can diagnose diseases more accurately than human doctors.
Okay.
And if we don't fully understand how it comes to those diagnoses, would you refuse that diagnosis just because you didn't get the AI's thought process?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I would want to know more.
Sure.
But if it meant a better chance of recovery, I might be okay with not having the full explanation.
Exactly. And that's the point the book is making. Sometimes the value of AI is in its ability to analyze massive amounts of data, identify these really complex patterns, and make predictions that we just can't do as humans.
Okay.
In those cases, demanding complete explainability might be like asking a chess grandmaster to explain every single move in a really complex match.
I see what you're saying.
It's technically possible, but is it really practical or even necessary to appreciate the brilliance of their strategy?
Okay. So we're not saying it's okay for AI to just be a black box. You should just trust it blindly.
No, not necessarily. It's more about recognizing that there are different levels of explainability and ethical considerations. Sometimes, like with medical diagnoses or financial modeling, a higher degree of transparency is crucial.
Of course.
But in other areas, like personalized recommendations or spam filtering, we might be okay with sacrificing some explainability if it means things work better.
Yeah, you're right. So it's not about ignoring ethics. It's more about realizing that different applications need different approaches to development.
You got it.
And the book actually argues that forcing those 5 characteristics onto all AI might make it less capable.
Less capable? How so?
Well, if developers are constantly worried about explaining every single decision, it might limit what they can do, like what kind of algorithms they use.
Yeah.
It's like trying to write a novel and having to constantly stop and explain your grammar and sentence structure. It would just stifle you.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. You'd be so focused on explaining everything that you wouldn't be able to just create and come up with new solutions.
Right?
So forcing explainability could actually hinder innovation.
It could. And there's another potential downside too.
Okay, tell me.
It might actually make AI easier to steal or hack.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. If someone can easily understand how your AI works,
Yeah, they might be able to reverse or find ways to exploit its weaknesses.
that's a scary thought.
It is, isn't it?
It's like leaving the blueprints for your house out in the open.
Exactly.
So explainability makes AI more vulnerable.
It's a trade-off. We want AI to be transparent, but that transparency can also be a risk.
So we need to be strategic about when we prioritize those 5 characteristics.
Definitely.
It's not one size fits all.
Exactly. We need to think about the context, the potential risks, and the goals before we decide how much to emphasize those things.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we're not always prioritizing explainability and ethics, how do we make sure AI is still being developed responsibly?
That's a great question, and it leads us to one of the coolest parts of the book.
Oh yeah.
The analogy of medical doctors adopting AI.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Imagine AI that can consistently outperform human doctors at diagnosing and treating diseases, even if we don't completely understand how it's doing. Would patients demand access to that AI diagnosis?
I mean,
Would they insist on a human doctor whose reasoning they understand, even if that human doctor might be less accurate?
that is a real dilemma. On the one hand, you want to trust the human expert.
Yeah,
But if the AI can actually save more lives, shouldn't we embrace it? Even if it's a bit of a black box?
exactly. It raises so many questions about expertise, trust, and the role of technology in healthcare.
And it makes you wonder if the same applies to other fields,
Like what?
like self-driving cars. If they cause fewer accidents than humans, would we favor them in regulations? Even if they can't explain every decision in a way that makes sense to us ethically.
That's a great point.
It seems like we have to decide what's more important, perfect explainability or actual results.
And the answer might be different depending on what we're talking about.
This is all so thought-provoking,
It is.
but I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, definitely.
There's so much more to discuss about AI development and how we navigate these ethical and practical challenges.
Absolutely. And you know what's even more interesting?
What's that?
Even if an AI system isn't perfectly explainable or ethical, it can still be incredibly valuable. The key is to manage these systems responsibly. We need to know their limitations and risks, but also recognize their potential for positive impact.
So how do we strike that balance?
Good question.
How do we manage these systems responsibly, especially when they're constantly learning and evolving?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, knowing that there's a system of accountability in place would bring us some peace of mind.
I like that idea.
Yeah, it would be like a seal of approval saying this AI has met certain standards for safety and reliability.
The book suggests having independent organizations that can certify AI systems for fairness, ethics, and interpretability.
So it's like a fair trade label, but for AI.
Exactly. Yeah, and it also proposes creating independent authorities that can actually rank AI systems for specific tasks.
So like consumer reports, but for AI.
Yes, precisely. It would bring so much transparency to the AI landscape.
Instead of relying on marketing hype, we could get some unbiased opinions on how these systems actually perform.
Exactly.
It feels like we're creating a whole new ecosystem around AI.
It does, doesn't it?
One that recognizes both its potential and its challenges.
Right? And it all goes back to Dr. Aggarwal's point that those 5 characteristics we've been discussing aren't always mandatory.
Yeah,
In fact, about 2/3 of the use cases they looked at don't actually need them.
it's a real shift in perspective. We've been so focused on these ideals that we forget AI can be valuable, even if it doesn't meet all of them.
Exactly.
So while those ideals are important, we also need to be practical.
Absolutely.
Sometimes focusing on efficiency and effectiveness can lead to better solutions, even if they aren't perfectly explainable. So we need to weigh the benefits against the risks,
Right?
and find ways to manage those risks responsibly.
Absolutely.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has. We've talked about a lot,
We've explored fairness in AI and ethical AI,
right? Those big questions.
and whether those characteristics are always necessary.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It's exciting and a little overwhelming all at the same time.
That's AI for you. Always pushing the boundaries.
So, what's coming up next in our AI exploration?
Get ready for a deep dive into the world of AI maintenance. We'll unpack why companies constantly rebuild and update their AI systems, even when it costs a fortune. We're talking about the relentless pursuit of accuracy, the surprising ways AI performance can degrade, and the entire complex world of machine learning operations, or MLOps.
I'm ready for whatever comes next in our AI journey.
Me too. Let's keep exploring. See you next time.